Hello, I'm Jonathan Dunsky, author of the Adam Lapid series. Thank you for being here. Today I have the honor and privilege of interviewing Mel Laytner, author of What They Didn't Burn, Uncovering My Father's Holocaust Secrets. Hello, Mel. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
I'd like, if I may, to begin this interview by actually reading the two first paragraphs from your book, because I think that this from the introduction. I think they give a sort of they give the tenor of the book quite well. So I'll just read them from the ebook. They burned his younger sister and her 2-year-old daughter. They burned his half brothers and their families. They burned his uncles and their wives. They murdered the sister's husband. He probably wasn't burned, but dumped into a shallow mass grave in the hills above a small village in western Poland. When they couldn't burn any more people, they set about burning the records and documents to hide their sins. What they didn't burn was a paper trail that tracked the man's journey through ghettos, slave labor, concentration camps, death marches, and more. They didn't burn the hidden records that revealed surprising and painful incidents he had never talked about, at least not to me, his son. If there are any aspiring writers who are watching this video, this is how you start a book. When I read the book, I read these two paragraphs and I thought, wow, I'm going to enjoy this book. And I ended up enjoying it even more. And I think I know why, and I think I'll reveal that a bit later. But what interested me about these initial two paragraphs is, of course, they relate to the burning, and the title of the book is What They Didn't Burn. So I'm wondering, were these written after you had the title, or did the title emerge from, this introduction or the entire book?
That was written after I had the title,
Oh,
and I
okay.
didn't have the title until 90% of the book was done.
Okay.
95% of the book was
I
done.
see.
The title is an interesting story. We could get to it later, but I was then actually tasked with trying to write back cover copy.
Okay.
And I started with that, and I said, you know what? That would make a pretty good introduction. And that's how it came to pass.
Well, I mean, writing the back cover is often more difficult than writing the actual book. You have to sort of condense, and it's also a different sort of a different writing because it's sort of a marketing writing. I mean, the object of the back cover text is to introduce the book to readers. So only readers who are interested in the book will actually pick it up, but you have to convince them this is the sort of book that they would like to read.
Yes.
So it's a daunting task. I've had many issues with that myself over several books. So I relate to your predicament, predicament there.
Yeah, I read your first book, and I'm just blown away at the idea that somebody can write a series of books with a cohesive character and vocabulary, and it just seems incredibly difficult and challenging to do that. By comparison, I thought my book, because it was nonfiction, was in a way easier. But I think the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you've done amazing research about that book, and we'll talk about that later. Of course, most of the research I did, or nearly all of it, was through the internet. You actually traveled to many countries in order to research this extraordinary piece of history, your father's history. And I'm interested in what prompted you to do that, because I know that your father, from the book, I know that your father did speak about his experiences. It wasn't a secret. He had a number tattoo on his arm. It was pretty evident that he went through Auschwitz. So what led you to start digging into his past?
I started because I actually wanted to write a piece of fiction.
Okay.
And he told me this story about a British POW who had done him a favor. And I thought that's a good, a short story, not even not a book, but just a short story. And then I just needed some context, place and time just to set it up. and I started tripping over facts on the internet at first. And the more facts I tripped over, the more excited I became. And one thing led to another. And then I went to do some research, drove up to Yale. It just seemed that things were breaking my way in finding out details and confirming little factoids that my father only hinted at. And then it just mushroomed from there. And it reached a point when I started finding documents, and I found more documents, and then I found more documents. This is over a period of time. It didn't happen in a month or 2 months or 3 months, but I started assembling all of this evidence, and they told a story by themselves. And it became very compelling for me to tell that story. And when I was describing it to my friends and to my family, I got excited. And they said, you should tell them I found this stuff. Yeah, that should be part of the story. I said, no. Reporters are never part of the story, But, over time, it became clear that to get the reader hooked, I felt I had to personalize it. People get connected to people, not just to dry history. And there you go. That's how it all came about.
Yeah, I mean, there are two interesting things about what you said. I mean, well, we learn about your father, his personal story, but we also learn about other individuals that he came into contact with. But from that, we can extrapolate, I mean, about the general condition of Jews in that area, or in death camps or labor camps in general. And there's also the fact that you were a journalist for many years, and it shows in the book. You actually adhered to journalistic principles when you researched all the facts that you later relate, because I think you actually you had to corroborate each piece of evidence more than once, or every story more than once, in order to actually feel comfortable to present it as fact.
Yes, I early on, well, it evolved also, because at first I didn't know what I was doing. And as I got into it, I was reading other books, historical fiction, but not clearly fiction. There were history that was, based on and so on. And and in those kinds of historical fiction, I get very nervous, because people read it, people who don't know a lot about, for example, the Holocaust, they read it and they assume, oh, this is how it happened, this is true. And some awful movies and television shows, that just distort things. And I kind of decided, well, the unique selling proposition of my book is going to be that it's factual, and that I'll have multiple sources. And I left out some really great vignettes, because I couldn't get them confirmed independently by either corroborating witnesses or documents, or a combination of the two. And the ones that I included, you can corroborate with each other, as I have several chapters of the book. So that to me was very important, because I was also thinking that I wanted this book to pass the sniff test of my former colleagues at United Press International and NBC News. I wanted them to be able to pick up the book and say, the kid still got it. That was important to me.
Okay, but what was in fiction, there's a thing called the inciting incident, where the character gets drawn into the story. For instance, in the detective stories, maybe he gets hired by someone, or he encounters a crime or a dead body. But what was the inciting incident that drove you to start this process? I mean, because you started it after your father passed away. You didn't start it you didn't start it years before. There was something that drove you, tip the scales in order to send you on this quest.
Well, the initial quest, as I say, was because I was depressed at work. I was working in business, and I felt I wasn't being creative, and I wanted to create something. So I wanted to write this fiction. And then I started, as I said, finding these things. But what tipped it over was finding that first Auschwitz document that just blew my socks off.
Is that the one about the diamonds, or the initial one about the diamonds?
Should we show it?
Well, I think so. I mean, it was very interesting to see.
Let's see if we can do this. Okay, this is it. This over here is the Auschwitz registration form. And this was the first document that came into my possession through the good offices of researchers at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. A cousin of mine had actually seen this in some obscure database or heard about it and tipped me off to it.
Okay.
And in this one document, in this one page, I learned more about my father at a certain point in time and place than he had ever told me. I would point out on the upper right corner is his Auschwitz tattoo number. On the lower left corner is his signature, which I would recognize any place. Mm-hmm. And in between, his life is reduced to one page. It tells you where he was, quote, arrested, the address, and the village is a town in Poland, a village in Poland, his street address, his father, his mother. It gives his height, his weight. Whoops, that's going ahead of it. And it shows here when he was, quote, arrested, April 1st, 1944. Well, I knew from my research by this time that this camp that my father was in, which was Blechhammer, had become part of Auschwitz on April 1st, 1944. And this put him there.
So he was actually arrested beforehand, or
yes,
he was already in a labor camp beforehand, but then it became under the administration of Auschwitz.
Yes, he was actually arrested on, and I believe the date is here, right above, June 23rd, 1943 in Shermashitsa. Okay. But he became registered on April 1st, 1944.
I see.
And with this information, I all of a sudden learned what ghetto he was in. So now I had to research the ghetto.
I see.
And that's how these things happen. You learn a little bit here, you learn a little bit here. For example, he wrote that my grandfather was dead, and my grandmother, where my grandmother was unknown. Well, that's not true. She was in the United States.
She had already gone there before the war.
Yes, she got to the United States to join her daughter, my father's younger sister, one of his younger sisters, in 1938. My father's sister had immigrated to the U.S. in 1931. Okay.
Why would he write that her whereabouts were unknown? What was
because by April 1st, 1944, the United States Air Force was bombing German cities, and saying that his mother was in the United States was not a smart move.
I see.
He also said that he had a third grade education, and he didn't. He graduated the public high school in Dumbrava, his town, and he lied about that. He told me this because the Germans would make fun of educated, uppity Jews, especially. So it's better to keep a low profile. So
he was already, showing his craftiness in a way, and knowing how to navigate the Germans in order to be on their relatively good side,
right,
to survive.
So this was the first, and after this, I started digging deeper.
Okay.
And I sent emails and letters and started researching. And about 6 months later, I got a thin envelope from the Auschwitz Museum, and among the documents was this one. Okay. This is my father. Again, his signature is on the bottom. This is a signed confession. This is my father's signed confession that he had been selling 15 diamonds where does a Jew get 15 diamonds in a
Incredible.
labor camp, to a Pole in exchange for food, et cetera, et cetera. And he received 500 Reichmarks. It was valued at 1,500 Reichmarks. And that's basically the signed confession. And his name is on the bottom. With this, and notice there's no date on this.
Okay.
Okay. With this piece of paper was this piece of paper, which is a report. Meldung is a report.
Mm-hmm.
And it references these diamonds, 15 diamonds, but it says this. This same prisoner was involved in an incident involving a forged railway identification card with prisoner Feder Chilik. Chilik Feder was one of my father's good friends. I knew him after the war for many, many years. And therefore, we believe that this prisoner, my father, was the go-between. I request the harshest possible punishment for this prisoner.
How did they survive this incident? I mean, they were basically trying to escape with the Germans. I mean, yeah. That's a sort of certain death sentence. So how did he wriggle out of that?
How? I'm not sure how, but I know he did. But let me, just to go back, what's critical about this is that my father told me a story when I was maybe 8 years old about how he had contacts with British POWs. He did them favors. His friend Chilik had contacts with somebody who we knew from before the war, a Christian Pole who had contacts with the Polish underground, and how he got the British to take headshots, photographs, and Chilik gave him to his Polish contact, who gave him to the Polish underground, and they were going to make identification cards for the Polish railway, and they were going to use these to escape. Except, my father told me, the Gestapo raided the forgery shop. They never found any photograph or any ID card with his name. They found it with Chilik's name.
Okay.
They traced it back to Blechhammer. They arrested Chilik. They tortured him. He implicated my father. My father said, and I acted stupid. I act like I know nothing what they're talking about. I acted completely stupid. And they didn't have any proof. And they sent Chilik to be gassed in Auschwitz. And how he escaped is another story, his story. And with me, he sort of that's how the story ended, pretty much. I was like, wow. But as I got older, I thought to myself, what do you mean? How? Because they didn't have proof.
Why would they need proof?
Why would they not hang him? Because these are the Germans, right? I mean, what are we talking about? But I never told that story to my kids, to my nieces. It's sort of, I really forgot about it.
Maybe you didn't even believe it in a way. Yeah. Did you actually believe it wholeheartedly? Or did you doubt it?
No, I sort of thought, well, when I was younger, I probably did. But as I got older, you get a little skeptical of.
Yeah, because it's an amazing story.
Right. And here I have a German document that essentially confirmed it.
Wow.
The whole thing. Okay, so now I'm digging even deeper. How did my father not get hung? I mean, how did he avoid? And I don't know. And I'm looking, and I went to Auschwitz. I interviewed historians over there. I interviewed historians in the United States. I spoke to survivors. The head historian at Auschwitz at the time, a guy named Franziszek Pieper,
mm-hmm.
He looked at the document. I handed it to him, and he said, and it came from his archives. But yeah, he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he said, they were hanging people for a lot less in Blechhammer those days. Okay. 3 months, 4 months go by. I'm at my desk. I casually type in the Google search bar my father's Polish spelling, Lajtner, Josef, and up comes a story from the Jerusalem Post of the previous April that a small museum in Israel, ghetto fighters' house near Nahariya, has a series of punishment reports. And one of the punishment reports is that Joseph Laytner got sentenced to 25 lashes for trying to sell 15 diamonds to a Polish Christian. I get in touch with the museum curator, and he sends me this. This is the first side of the report, and it again has my father's name, his date of birth, the date of the incident, and it says 18 diamonds, or 15 diamonds were traded and so on. And you can see it's all very official. The type of arrest is a Jew. And then the back of this form is very interesting. Over here, we see a checkbox. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. 25 is initialed. And
25
over
lashes.
here,
Wow.
25 lashes.
The maximum.
Yes.
Wow.
And down here, as I'm in shock looking at this with all the rubber stamps and signatures and everything, then down here I notice the date it was carried out and the officer who carried out, or the SS man who carried out, is crossed off, and it's written Haftlinge, which means prisoner.
Prisoner, yeah.
And has his name, Joseph Brasem.
And his number.
And a tattoo number.
Wow.
I get in touch with my contacts at Auschwitz, and it turns out that whoever typed this up had inverted 167. It's really 176. So now I had a tattoo number, and Auschwitz confirmed that he was a Dutch prisoner, a Dutch Jewish prisoner at Blechhammer. Of course, this leads you to another investigation.
Quite amazing.
And I dug up Joseph Brasem's life. I found, I believe, 3 or 4 survivors who I interviewed by phone. I checked out some databases, and I determined that he didn't die at Blechhammer, he didn't die in Gross-Rosen, and he didn't die in, and he was admitted to Buchenwald.
Let's just give a quick, say a few words about all these camps, because I think that many people are not familiar with, with these names.
At the end of the war, the Russians were coming from the east, and the Germans were evacuating all of the POWs and prisoners in their Polish and annexed Polish labor camps and POW camps. My father was on a death march, and I have other documents about that went from Blechhammer to another camp 180 kilometers away, or 180 miles away, I guess, Gross-Rosen. From Gross-Rosen, they were shipped by train to Buchenwald. Buchenwald, they were registered. And I got a hold of the registration lists of the Auschwitz prisoners, which were 4,600 names over about 100 pages, typed in alphabetical order by nationality, broken down within nationality between politicals and Jews.
And we should say that this is in the final months of the war, where Germany is already on its last legs. It's quite exceptional that they went to this much trouble to register all the prisoners and to do it so meticulously. I mean, there was absolutely no point in doing that. It's quite amazing.
I found the written logs, and then from the written logs, and the written logs are just in numerical order of the numbers that they gave out to the prisoners as they were being registered. They just had an empty log book with numbers. Somebody had to go through those pages, pull everything out by nationality, then pull it out and sort it by Jew and non-Jew and mixed race. And within each of those, put it in alphabetical order. But thanks to the efficiency of the SS, I was able to find my father's record in about 5 minutes. And thanks to the efficiency of the SS, I determined that Joseph Brasem was admitted and registered in Buchenwald on February 10th, 1945. Well, from there, some more research. I got in touch with Dutch authorities, and I actually got a hold of Joseph Brasem's 13-page testimonial in Dutch where he doesn't mention at all beating prisoners. And for my research in Auschwitz, in the archives, and in Israel at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, I found, I believe, 14 or 16 reports similar to this, where Joseph Brassam beat prisoners. However, it's in the book. I don't want to give away too much.
Yeah.
It's a much more complicated story
Yeah.
than this. And I included it in the book because it's important to understand or to appreciate the nuances of what it took to survive.
Yeah.
What it took to survive.
I remember another story from your book in which a German guard, brings your father to the Judenaltester, or the senior Jew in Blechhammer, and he says, he did this and he did that, and the Judenaltester punishes your father he beats your father, and thereby he saves his life. I mean, he does this, he makes the decision to punish him himself, so the German guard wouldn't do it and do much more.
Yes. The Judenaltester is a originally Austrian Jew, moved to Poland just in time for the war, named Karl Demerer. And because he spoke German fluently, and he worked as in an insurance office in Poland, but for a German insurance company, he was good at paperwork. Mm-hmm. And the Germans liked that. So he was named head Jew, or the Judenältester, in charge of everything inside the wire, with his own crew of capos and assistant capos and a whole bureaucracy inside the wire. And unlike other camps, Karl Demerer has been credited with saving many, many lives. Oh. And my father's life is just one of many. I spoke to many survivors, well, more than a handful, and in testimonials that give him credit for saving many lives. And he just was honored in 2015, I believe, by the ADL because the righteous of the nations, Yad Vashem, are only for non-Jews.
That's right. Yeah.
And you cannot, if you're a Jew and you save many lives, there was never any recognition till the ADL created this, and he was honored about it. Now, when he moved to Israel around 1966, he had a birthday, and he had a huge party in his honor, and they created a big thank you card on a large piece of oak tag. And about 150 Blechhammer survivors signed this card and put their Auschwitz numbers underneath it.
Wow.
So he's also part of the story.
Yeah, I read about him. I've read about him later, and I've never heard about him before I read your book. And he's one of those people that I feel that I should have known about him, because he was a true hero, and yes. He took great risks upon himself when other camp leaders or leaders in other camps did not. So it's an exceptional story. But let's talk a bit about what Blechhammer was, because I think most people have never heard about that place, even though it was a fairly large camp.
Yes, it was the second largest labor camp within the Auschwitz system. There was, of course, the three main Auschwitz camps, briefly. The main Auschwitz camp, which was for political prisoners, and for a while, Russian POWs. There was Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the infamous death camp. And then there was Auschwitz-Monowitz, or Buna, which was the first labor camp. This is where Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi worked as forced laborers. And then there were
dozens,
more than 20 other satellite camps, especially after April 1st, 1944, because a lot of labor camps were incorporated into the Auschwitz system. And Blechhammer became the second largest labor camp with about 4,000 prisoners, and it was the largest exclusively Jewish labor camp within the German archipelago system of labor camps, and there were hundreds. So Blechhammer specifically was one of a number of camps, POW camps, and quote, guest labor camps that were building huge synthetic fuel refineries, which were the hope of the German industry, since they didn't have natural fuel, to build these synthetic fuel refineries. And the goal was to make Germany energy independent. They built, I believe, a string from 1933 to toward the end of the war. They built about 14 of these, and they were very important. And so they became a prime target when the United States started bombing and could get within range of these refineries in Romania and in Blechhammer and in other places.
But before Blechhammer became part of Auschwitz, it was part of a different organization of camps, which I found very interesting, which you also talk about in the book, something called Organization Schmelt.
Yes, the Organization Schmelt. It's sort of like you get into the deep weeds on some of this stuff, yeah. But the Organization Schmelt was actually created by Himmler, because the Jews of this part of Poland that my father was in, which 100,000 Jews, was in a section of Poland that became annexed into Germany. So they weren't occupied, they were actually annexed as part of Germany. However, the Jews were disenfranchised. They couldn't work any place. They weren't allowed to, they were, their assets were frozen. They couldn't have public jobs. And the local population, or the local German civilian leaders, were screaming, look, at least put them to work so that they could, earn their own rations. Himmler saw an opportunity. He assigned a Brigadier General, Albrecht Schmelt, and Albrecht Schmelt became in charge of what they called foreign workers within this territory. The foreign workers were Jews who lived there. And he was a very able administrator. He created a 3-level bureaucracy. There was labor camps. There were shops within towns and villages that entrepreneurial ethnic Germans like Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List was one, took over factories and had contracts with the German military. And he also lent out workers to other factories as well. And he took a cut of all of the salaries, and the Oskar Schindlers of the world, who weren't paying Social Security benefits, gave the money to the SS instead. So the SS had an independent income stream outside of the finance ministry, which is something that Himmler had been trying to accomplish for years.
It's like, it's sort of like a mafia in a way.
Yes.
It's a different sort of criminality, of course, than the extermination of Jews. I mean, the purpose was to squeeze as much as possible from the Jews before liquidating them. Yes.
I was going to say that in modern day, think of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who run their own armaments industry outside of the Iranian military. They're sort of separate, and they have their own budget lines. And this is basically what Himmler wanted for the SS. Now, it's true that they needed foreign workers because the Eastern Front and the war was eating up Germans. But in this little piece of Poland, this little niche of Poland, avoided most of that because Albrecht Schmelt ensured that the economic needs trumped racial ideology. So while ghettos came into Warsaw early in the war, they didn't come into that part of Poland until late 1942, 2.5 years later, and so on. And in the Schmelt camps, nobody died of starvation in Schmelt while Schmelt was running it. In the concentration camps, they were dying like flies.
Yeah.
And after Blechhammer and 40 or between Auschwitz and another concentration camp, Gross-Rosen, 40 camps were taken over. That's when things got pretty bad, very
Because
bad.
by then the main purpose was to kill the prisoners and not to put them to work.
They or work them to death.
Yeah.
As the German justice minister called it, extermination through labor.
Yeah. And in Blechhammer and in other camps as well, there was a sort of inversion of, let's say, the social strata or the social hierarchy compared to ordinary society.
Absolutely.
Blue collar workers they got the coveted jobs. They were treated much better, and white collar prisoners got the worst of it, and had a much lower chance of survival.
Yes, I pointed that out in a chapter that I say society was turned on its head.
Oh, okay.
If you were a shoemaker and you could make boots, the Germans supplied you with the leather.
Yeah, they wanted you around. They needed you.
Yeah, yeah, and these guys had food, and they were warm, and they were protected. So I call them the royalty.
Okay.
The nobility were the skilled workers. My father was a skilled welder. If you were an electrician, a machinist, a welder, you got more food. Officially, you got more calories than an unskilled worker. And then if you were a teacher, a lawyer, a white collar worker, you were the serfs.
Yeah.
You had no useful skills, and you were put to the hardest labor with the highest mortality rates.
And of course, and a lot of these jobs were done outdoors. When in the Polish winter, that would kill you quite quickly. And other jobs, more coveted jobs, were done indoors, and then you were warmer and were able to conserve your energy. So yeah, it was quite something to see that everything turned on its head. Of course, the world went crazy, and that was just one of the ways in which it went crazy.
I think the book, I tried very hard to bring in these other aspects to it, because I was fascinated by the nitty-gritty, the actual, what did people do to survive? Okay, they bribed this, but what does it really mean in the context of a labor camp? What did you have to do? And in one of the chapters, Bread and Other Survivor Stories, I point out one guy could make out of insulating clay, could make little figurines, and he would trade that for food. Somebody else, electricians, were good at making these sort of electric stoves with wire and wood that they sold to the British POWs. So the British POWs could heat up their Red Cross tins of corned beef, and in exchange, they'd get chocolate from that they got in their Red Cross, and with chocolate, you could then trade it for bread. And everything got traded down to bread.
Bread is the currency of the camp.
That was the lingua franca of survival. But how you got there? My father was a welder. He was able to do favors. He got paid off in cigarettes. Cigarettes could be traded for bread. He got chocolate. Chocolate could be traded for bread. People got watches smuggled in. They were traded for bread. Nobody carried around the watch. It was what you could get for it. And I think what I tried to do is show so that someone who has an idea of what the Holocaust is, but doesn't really know what survival meant, I wanted to get that across. This is what it took to survive. This is what my father did, and this is what a number of other people did, day to day, day in and day out.
I wanted to say, when you were showing your documents earlier, I said that there's a reason why I enjoyed your book much more than I expected to when I started reading it, even though I knew it would be good, is because I write detective fiction, and this is also what I like to read. And in many ways, your book is a detective story. You were the detective. You weren't solving a crime, but you were going through the regular motions of a detective. Going to places, interviewing people, finding evidence, and piecing together a story to solve a mystery. And I think that's people who read mystery fiction would enjoy your book, even though it's nonfiction, because it it corresponds to that genre in many ways. And you actually solve the mystery of your father in a way throughout this book, and you discovered a totally different person than the one you knew as a child or as the father you grew up with. Can
Yes,
you tell us a bit about that? I mean, the difference between the father that you knew when you were a child in the US and the father that you discovered during the
sure.
war?
My father, you'd never use the word hero and dad in the same
Okay.
sentence with my father. Okay,
I'm
he
laughing
was
because I read the book, so I know what you mean. So yeah.
he was quiet. He was self-effacing. He was a reader. He would read endlessly. He was very self-educated, um, but he was very passive, it seemed to me. And yeah, he told me stories on his lap when I was a young kid, but that really ended by the time I went to high school. And then you're told to sit on dad's lap, and then you're a high school kid. You have your own life. You just take off. So a lot of that stuff ended. And my dad worked all of his life very hard in a factory, and then a candy store, and eventually his linen shop. But he wasn't. He didn't turn heads when he walked into a party. He wasn't
Okay.
that sort of guy. Color him gray.
Hmm.
And then I start coming across these stories and these people who knew him. And here's a guy who not only smuggled diamonds on his own. I just showed you 3 of the documents. I have others. But it turns out he was a go-to guy for smuggling and dealing with diamonds. And he was involved in a lot of, shall we say, black market activity to survive. And he took chances and he took risks
Hmm.
that he never shared with me. And of course, when I looked back, I realized that for a lot of my childhood, he was probably suffering from depression and some form of PTSD, and he was suffering. I had no clue. I had no clue. This was dad, and only in retrospect do I realize that it probably took him decades to get over it and to become happy again. Uh, and that was a rather somber realization that you have about the man who raised you. You know,
Did you also, um, when you read about what your father went through and you got into, as you say, the nitty gritty, did it also, I mean, make you think about differently about his story of survival, the things that he went through? I mean, his suffering there and your mother's suffering as well, because your mother is also a survivor. When you think about, we know certain things about the Holocaust. We know they were cold and they were hungry. And of course, we know about all the people who died. But I've researched this about from one of my books as well. I didn't think about all the little things. How did the place smell? How was it to sleep crowded in? All these tiny things. How did they make you feel when you got to know them, when they sort of?
I Jonathan, I tell you that I was able to write about this uh, partly, I think greatly, not partly, but greatly because um, I was able to set up an emotional firewall.
Mhm.
I came across this stuff and I got excited as a reporter and as a
Okay.
writer. And uh, I was more obsessed with how am I going to explain this without being schmaltzy.
I see.
How do you write it in such a way that will be powerful without being melodramatic? And I recorded all of these things that people told me of how it smelled and what it looked like, and the fears that people had. I had gotten from several people what it was like being evacuated from the ghetto on that train to Blechhammer, because I was actually interviewed 3 people who were on the train with my father.
Wow.
You know, so I got all of that. And then the challenge is, okay, you know it. It didn't really hit me as a human. I sort of internalized it as a reporter. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So you were able to create a distance between yourself and the story.
I had to, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to write it.
I see.
I wouldn't let a lot of the. So, well, look, you see, you get one of these documents and it stops.
Yeah.
It hits you, and then you gotta lock it up and go and say, okay, and you start looking at it. Well, look at this and look at this, and this will lead me here. And what about this? And you go into that mode, and that's where I lived. You know, if I didn't erect that kind of firewall, I think it would have really torn me up a lot. And my brother, you know, doesn't think that I'm telling the truth but he showed me that a lot of painful childhood memories I just managed to sublimate. Yeah. And maybe that's how I got through it all, writing the book as well.
You can see it in your writing style. It's very spare. It's sort of I have to say, when I think about it, I thought about it earlier today, and the term refreshing, old-fashioned style in a way. It sort of harkens back to the sort of books that I like to read from, you know, the hard-boiled stuff from the 1940s and 50s. There's a sort of, you know, we don't get too emotional. We deal with the facts, and this is how we go about our business in a way. But I found it very interesting because you were writing about your father, you know, a man you deeply loved, and you see all these, you get hit by all that he went through, or much that he went through. But what was amazing about this story is how he managed to, you know, you wrote in the book that he said that everything hinged on luck.
Yeah.
But
clearly not.
He was very active. I mean, he was always always looking for to improve his lot during the camp.
Walter Spitzer was a French artist who passed away in 2021.
An amazing painter. Yeah.
Yeah. He was my father's friend from the ghettos through the labor camps, and then after the war, they remained friends for 40 years. When I showed him the diamond documents, and there are a series of them, and I asked him, Walter, did my father ever talk to you about diamonds? And he goes, no. I go, no? He goes, not in 40 years. He never mentioned diamonds. That kind of is interesting, right? One of his good friends. And so then I said, it's not a big deal. He only talked about diamonds in passing, how you really needed luck more than money to, and Walter stopped me. And he looks at me and he goes, listen, you need luck, but with diamonds, you can improve your luck. You better improve your luck. And that was one of the great insights. The people who survived, you needed luck.
Yeah.
You could be brilliant. You could be the world's greatest smuggler. You could talk your way out of anything, blah, blah, but you needed luck. After you had that luck, to be alive, I think you had to be proactive. Mm-hmm. You had to improve your luck. You had to make hot plates for British POWs. Like Walter Spitzer, you had to be able to draw portraits of German foremen and POWs and exchange it for food. Like my father, you had to be able to smuggle and trade almost anything. people had to improve their luck. And I think that comes through in the narrative. Yeah, luck, but you had to improve your luck. That was a great takeaway.
And can you tell us a bit about what happened after the war, where your parents met? Because your mother was also in Auschwitz, correct?
Yes.
She came from Hungary in the spring or summer of 1944.
She
During
came.
that,
She arrived in
those horrible
Auschwitz,
months.
Erev Shavuot, 1944. I tracked down the date.
Okay.
Unlike my father, my mother never spoke about her experiences. Just in the most cursory 2 or 3 sentence way, the night that they arrived in Birkenau, where she was separated from my grandfather. She was sent to labor, and he was sent to his death. And the rest I found out largely from friends of hers living in Israel at the time. I interviewed there were 5 women that shared a sleeping shelf. Mm-hmm. And they became known as, in Yiddish, the Fünf Schwesters, the 5 sisters. And they formed a bond and they protected each other. Anyway, many years after my mother's death, I interviewed 3 of the remaining 5. And then I got out some documents also, which confirmed what they told me about places and their timeline. Anyhow, she was liberated by the Americans. My father escaped and was liberated by the French. Somehow they both ended up in Paris. After the war, they met. They were married that year. At the end of 1945, they were married in front of a rabbi, not civilly. And my father had family, his mother and a sister in the US. My mother had a brother in the US. By 1948, they got their visas, they emigrated. My father started working as a finishing presser at Ripley's clothing store in 1949. I have his union card, so I have the date pretty well nailed. And then they built a life. And the book kind of recounts that to
it's an interesting story
as well, because I think it's important that we understand that the survivors, they didn't roll up into a ball and bemoan their lives afterwards. They went out and they created new lives. And a lot of us kind of don't really appreciate that enough, that they built new families. Yeah. It took a lot to do. And I didn't want to look, it doesn't have a Pollyanna ending, but it does have a positive ending. It is to show that the human spirit was there with these survivors. And I think I start with in the book pretty early on about the circle of friends my parents had, and I pretty much ended it that way too, that these are people who built new lives. They weren't just victims. They didn't want to be defined as victims. And that's a very important takeaway for all of us.
I agree. Well, I think that on that note, we should conclude this very interesting and wonderful interview. I should say that I read the book and I also listened to the audiobook, which is very well done. So, and you'll find links to the book in the description below. And I want to thank you, Mel, for spending this hour with me. It was amazing. And thank you for writing this book. It's an exceptional book.
Thank you. And I have to say that reading your book was an eye-opener as well. And I love the way it built. It got me at the end. I thought I knew how it was going to end, but it didn't. It ended. Oh man, he got me. And I kind of smiled at that because it was an enjoyable read. It really was. And I'm looking forward to getting the others now and plowing through them, which I'm looking forward to that in a big way.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I think I'll say again, I think that people who are interested in World War II history and the Holocaust should read this book, What They Didn't Burn, because I've read a lot a lot of memoirs, and this one is special in many ways. So thank you for joining us today for this interview. And if you'd like to get notified of when I post new interviews and new videos, please subscribe to my channel. And until next time, I'm Jonathan Dunsky. Have a great day.